Maya Jain always sat in the back row of Computer Science 301. She chose this spot on purpose. It was safe there, away from the eyes that might notice how her fingers tapped nervously on her laptop whenever Professor Reynolds scanned the room for his next victim. Today was no different. The classroom buzzed with the usual pre-class chatter as students filed in. Some talked about weekend plans, others frantically finished the coding assignment due that morning. Maya had completed hers 3 days ago, but she checked it one more time anyway. "All right, settle down," Professor Reynolds called out as he entered the room. His tall figure commanded attention, hair perfectly styled and his button-down shirt without a single wrinkle. He was known throughout the computer science department for two things: his brilliant mind and his zero tolerance for what he called mediocrity. Maya shrunk further into her seat. She had spent 4 years in America since moving from Shanghai, but still felt like an outsider. Her English was good, but her accent made her self-conscious. In group discussions, she often stayed quiet, even when she knew the answers. Professor Reynolds started his lecture on algorithm efficiency. His eyes swept the room as he asked questions. Most students avoided eye contact, hoping to escape his harsh judgment. "Can someone tell me the time complexity of a binary search?" he asked, his gaze finally landing on Maya. "Ms. Zhang, perhaps you could enlighten us." Maya's heart raced. "It's O log n," she said softly. "Speak up, Ms. Zhang. If you're going to answer, at least do it so the rest of us can hear." Maya cleared her throat. "O log n," she repeated, louder this time. Professor Reynolds nodded. "And why is that?" She explained the concept carefully, her voice gaining a little strength as she focused on the familiar material. This was the one place she felt confident, in the logic and structure of code. What Maya didn't share was that she had been coding since she was 10 years old. Her father, a software engineer, had taught her the basics, and she quickly surpassed his lessons. By 16, she had built several apps that her high school friends used. Now, at 19, she worked on complex projects in her free time that even some professionals would find challenging. But Professor Reynolds only saw a quiet Asian girl who rarely spoke in class. He had decided early in the semester that her silence meant she didn't belong in his advanced course. After class, Maya checked the online course portal. Her heart sank. Her latest assignment had received a C+, despite meeting all requirements. The comments simply read, "Code works but lacks creativity. See me after next class." Walking back to her dorm room, Maya felt the familiar weight of frustration. Her roommate, Leela, noticed her expression immediately. "Reynolds again?" Leela asked, looking up from her textbook. Maya nodded, dropping her backpack on the floor. "I don't understand what he wants from me." "He's tough on everyone," Leela said, but they both knew it wasn't entirely true. Professor Reynolds seemed to have particular disdain for Maya. That night, while other students went out to celebrate the weekend, Maya stayed in, reviewing the professor's lecture notes and working on her project. The code flowed naturally as she typed, creating elegant solutions to complex problems. This was her true voice, expressed in lines of perfectly structured code. Little did she know that Monday's class would change everything. Monday morning arrived with dark clouds hanging low in the sky. Maya hurried across campus, clutching her laptop bag close to protect it from the light drizzle. The weather matched her mood perfectly. She had spent the entire weekend reviewing her assignment, trying to figure out what Professor Reynolds meant by lacks creativity. After hours of work, she had completely rebuilt her code with a different approach. It wasn't just functional now, it was elegant. Maya arrived early to class and took her usual seat in the back. She opened her laptop and ran through her revised code one last time. Each function worked perfectly. "Impressive work," said a voice. Maya looked up to see Jason, one of the top students in class, glancing at her screen. "Did you use the Dijkstra algorithm for that part? I never thought of applying it there." Maya nodded, surprised by the compliment. "It makes the search more efficient." "Cool, maybe we could study together sometime," Jason suggested. Before Maya could answer, Professor Reynolds walked in, his face stern as always. The room quickly fell silent. "Today, we'll be reviewing your assignments," he announced. "I've selected a few examples to discuss, some good, some—" He paused, his eyes scanning the room. "Not so good." Maya's stomach tightened. She knew what was coming before he even said her name. "Let's start with Ms. Zhang's work," Professor Reynolds said, connecting his laptop to the projector. Maya's code appeared on the screen, the original version from her first submission, not her revised work. "Can anyone identify the problems here?" he asked the class. A few students raised their hands, pointing out minor issues. With each comment, Maya felt smaller in her seat. The worst part was that she had already fixed all these problems in her new version. "Sir," Maya started, her voice shaking slightly, "I submitted a revised." "Ms. Zhang, I'm discussing the work you turned in by the deadline." Professor Reynolds cut her off sharply. "Late revisions aren't acceptable in the real world." Maya checked the course portal on her laptop. Her revised submission had been uploaded on Saturday, well before the Monday deadline listed in the syllabus. She raised her hand again. "Professor, the syllabus says revisions are accepted until Monday at 8 a.m. I submitted mine on Saturday." The classroom grew uncomfortably quiet. Other students exchanged glances, some checking the syllabus on their own computers. Professor Reynolds frowned. "That's not what—" he began, then stopped as he checked his own computer. His frown deepened. "Nevertheless, we're discussing your original work today." From the middle row, Jason spoke up. "Actually, sir, I saw Maya's revised code before class. She used Dijkstra's algorithm in a really creative way." Several students turned to look at Maya with new interest. Professor Reynolds' face flushed slightly. "That's enough, Jason," he said sharply. "Ms. Zhang, if you're so confident in your revised work, perhaps you'd like to present it to the class tomorrow? Let's see if it's as creative as Jason claims." Maya's heart raced, but she managed to nod. "Yes, I can do that." As class ended, several students stopped by Maya's desk. "Don't let him get to you," one girl said quietly. "He did the same thing to me last semester." "Your code was solid," added another. "He just doesn't like being challenged." For the first time, Maya realized she wasn't alone. As she packed up her things, she noticed Jason waiting by the door. "Want to grab coffee and talk about that algorithm?" he asked. Maya smiled slightly. "Yes, I'd like that." Walking across campus, Maya felt something shift inside her. Tomorrow, she would show Professor Reynolds and the entire class exactly what she could do. Maya barely slept that night. After her coffee with Jason, she had spent hours perfecting her presentation for the next day. Her revised code was already strong, but now she added detailed comments and prepared explanations for each section. If Professor Reynolds wanted to challenge her, she would be ready. The morning arrived too quickly. Maya stood in front of her bathroom mirror, practicing what she would say. Her roommate Leela poked her head through the doorway. "You're going to do great," Leela said, giving Maya an encouraging smile. "Jason texted me that half the class is excited to see you prove Reynolds wrong." Maya's eyes widened. "Half the class knows about this?" "More like the whole class," Leela admitted. "Word travels fast. Apparently some seniors are even planning to sit in." Maya's hands began to shake. Being the center of attention was exactly what she had always tried to avoid. She took several deep breaths, remembering her father's words from years ago. "Your code speaks for you. Let it do the talking." When Maya arrived at the classroom, she was shocked to find it nearly full 15 minutes before class was scheduled to begin. Students from other sections had indeed come to watch. Jason waved her over to a seat he had saved near the front. "Everyone's on your side," he whispered as she sat down. "Reynolds has been doing this for years. It's about time someone stood up to him." Professor Reynolds entered precisely at 10 o'clock a.m., his face darkening at the sight of the packed room. He glanced at Maya briefly before starting his lecture without acknowledging the unusual attendance. "Today we'll be discussing advanced optimization techniques," he began, completely ignoring their planned review of Maya's code. For 40 minutes, he lectured without mentioning Maya's presentation. Some students began exchanging confused looks, while others seemed increasingly annoyed. With just 10 minutes of class remaining, a senior in the back raised his hand. "Professor, weren't we supposed to review a student's creative approach to the assignment today?" Professor Reynolds frowned. "We've covered more important material instead. If there's time next class." "The syllabus says project reviews are part of our participation grade," another student interrupted. "And you specifically asked Maya to present today." All eyes turned to Maya. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. But something inside her had reached a breaking point. Months of being overlooked, underestimated, and unnecessarily criticized pushed her to stand up. "I'm prepared to present, Professor," Maya said, her voice steadier than she expected. "I brought my revised code as you requested." Professor Reynolds' jaw tightened. "Very well, Ms. John. You have the remaining 7 minutes. Maya walked to the front of the room and connected her laptop to the projector. As her code appeared on the screen, she took a deep breath. "The assignment asked us to create a sorting algorithm for large datasets," she began. "My original approach used a standard merge sort, but I realized we could optimize it further." As she explained her work, the nervousness faded away. This was her element: logical, elegant solutions to complex problems. She walked through her implementation of Dijkstra's algorithm, showing how she had adapted it to make the sorting process more efficient. Students nodded with understanding, some taking notes. Even a few who had never spoken to her looked impressed. With 1 minute remaining, Professor Reynolds stood up. "That's enough, Ms. Zhang. Your time is up." "I'm not finished explaining the final optimization," Maya replied. "I said your time is up," he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Tomorrow we'll examine why your approach is fundamentally flawed for real-world applications." As Maya returned to her seat, she noticed something she'd never seen before: the barely contained anger in Professor Reynolds' eyes. She had challenged him in front of his students, and he wasn't going to let it go. The battle lines were drawn. The next day, Maya arrived to find the classroom even more crowded than before. Word had spread about her confrontation with Professor Reynolds, and now students were sitting on the floor and standing against the walls. She spotted several teaching assistants from other computer science courses quietly slipping in at the back. Maya slid into her seat next to Jason, who gave her a thumbs up. "Everyone's talking about your algorithm," he whispered. "Some senior students tried to implement it last night and said it works even better than you showed." Before she could respond, Professor Reynolds strode in, his face a controlled mask of professionalism. He carried a thick folder under his arm and wore a crisp white shirt that seemed to highlight the tightness around his mouth. "Today we'll continue our discussion of optimization techniques," he announced, ignoring the unusual crowd. "But first, I want to address Ms. Zhang's presentation from yesterday." He connected his laptop to the projector. On the screen appeared Maya's code, but it was different. Parts had been rearranged, variables renamed, and several functions altered. "This is Ms. Zhang's approach," he stated, though Maya immediately recognized the changes. While creative, it contains fundamental flaws that would make it useless in any professional setting. For the next 10 minutes, Professor Reynolds methodically tore apart the code on screen, pointing out inefficiencies and potential bugs. With each criticism, Maya felt her face grow hotter, but not from embarrassment, from frustration. He was criticizing code that wasn't hers. Finally, she raised her hand. Professor Reynolds ignored her. "Sir," she said loudly, without waiting to be called on, "that's not my code." The room fell silent. "Excuse me?" Professor Reynolds turned to her, his expression cold. "The code you're showing isn't what I presented yesterday. Several functions have been changed, and the Dijkstra implementation is completely different." Professor Reynolds' face hardened. "Ms. Zhang, are you suggesting I modified your code?" "I'm saying this isn't my work," Maya answered, opening her laptop. "I can show the original if." "Perhaps," Professor Reynolds interrupted. "Instead of making accusations, you should demonstrate your supposed expertise. If my version has so many flaws, come fix them." He gestured to the computer at the front of the class. "Show us all how a first-year student knows better than someone with 20 years of industry experience." The challenge hung in the air. Maya felt every eye in the room on her. This was exactly the kind of public spotlight she had always avoided. For a moment, she considered simply apologizing and sitting down. But then she saw Leila at the back of the room, giving her an encouraging nod. Jason whispered, "You've got this." Maya stood up. With each step toward the front of the classroom, her heart beat faster. But with each step, something else grew stronger too: determination. She took her place at the computer, and Professor Reynolds stepped back with a satisfied smirk. He clearly expected her to falter under pressure. "You have 10 minutes to fix the errors I've supposedly introduced," he said. and I want you to explain every change to the class. Maya looked at the code on screen. It was a mess, deliberately so, she realized. The professor had taken her elegant solution and sabotaged it, creating bugs and inefficiencies that would be difficult to spot quickly. The clock is ticking, Ms. Jiang, Professor Reynolds said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Maya took a deep breath and placed her fingers on the keyboard. She would need to be methodical, starting with the most obvious issues and working toward the subtle ones. First, she said, her voice growing steadier as she began to type, I'll fix the variable declarations that are causing memory leaks. As her fingers flew across the keyboard, something unexpected happened. The nervous first-year student disappeared, replaced by the confident coder who had been solving complex problems since childhood. Professor Reynolds watched, his smirk slowly fading as Maya worked through his deliberate errors one by one, explaining each fix with growing confidence. The battle had truly begun. 5 minutes into Maya's challenge, the classroom remained completely silent except for the sound of her typing. Every student watched intently as her fingers moved across the keyboard with surprising speed and precision. Even the teaching assistants at the back had edged closer, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and growing admiration. Professor Reynolds stood to the side, arms crossed tightly across his chest. His confident smirk had vanished, replaced by a slight frown as he watched Maya methodically repair his sabotage. The memory allocation here was deliberately inefficient, Maya explained as she rewrote a section of code. By using dynamic allocation instead of fixed arrays, we can save significant memory while processing large datasets. She didn't just fix the problems, she improved the code beyond her original version. As the timer on Professor Reynolds' watch ticked past 7 minutes, Maya had already corrected the major flaws and moved on to optimizing sections that weren't even broken. This loop structure creates unnecessary iterations, she said, rewriting a particularly complex section. By implementing a binary search pattern here, we can reduce the processing time from own to own login. A whispered wow came from somewhere in the middle of the room. Several students had pulled out their phones and were quietly recording Maya's demonstration. 8 minutes in, Professor Reynolds cleared his throat. Ms. Jiang, you're simply making arbitrary changes now. This isn't fixing errors, it's improving efficiency. Maya finished for him, not taking her eyes off the screen. The original version works, but this optimization reduces processing time by approximately 40%. To demonstrate, she quickly wrote a test function and ran both versions side by side. The results appeared on screen, clearly showing her optimized code finishing significantly faster. A few students in the front row actually applauded. This is outside the scope of the assignment, Professor Reynolds insisted, his voice rising slightly. Maya finally turned to look at him. You asked me to fix the code and explain my changes. That's what I'm doing. Something shifted in the room. Students who had spent the entire semester intimidated by Professor Reynolds were now watching Maya stand her ground with growing respect. When the 10-minute timer beeped, Maya stepped back from the computer. I've corrected all the introduced errors and optimized the critical sections. The algorithm now runs more efficiently than both my original version and the modified one you presented. Professor Reynolds stepped forward, clearly intending to reclaim control of the class. While Ms. Jiang has made some interesting changes, let me point out several theoretical issues with her approach. But as he began to criticize, one of the teaching assistants from the back raised his hand. Professor, I believe her implementation actually follows the optimization patterns recommended in the latest ACM journal. Another TA nodded. The dynamic memory allocation approach she used is what we teach in advanced systems programming. It's considered industry best practice. Professor Reynolds' face flushed. He was no longer facing just one student but being challenged by his own colleagues. He turned to Maya, who stood quietly by the computer. Where did you learn these techniques, Ms. Jiang? He asked, his tone somewhere between suspicion and genuine curiosity. This goes well beyond first-year curriculum. Maya thought about her father's late-night coding sessions, the online forums where she had connected with programmers around the world, and the countless hours she had spent solving problems just for the joy of finding elegant solutions. I've been coding since I was 10, she said simply, and I never stopped learning. The classroom erupted in spontaneous applause. Even some of Professor Reynolds' most loyal students joined in, recognizing that they had just witnessed something remarkable. For the first time since she had entered his classroom, Professor Reynolds looked at Maya, really looked at her, and saw not a quiet, struggling student but someone with genuine talent. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone knew it. Professor Reynolds cleared his throat loudly, struggling to regain control of his classroom. The applause for Maya finally died down, but the energy in the room had completely transformed. Students who had spent the semester avoiding eye contact now sat up straight, many looking at Maya with newfound respect. "Well, that was interesting," Professor Reynolds said, his voice strained. "Let's move on to today's scheduled material." But a hand shot up from the back of the room. It belonged to Dr. Patel, the department chair of computer science, who had slipped in during Maya's demonstration without anyone noticing. "Professor Reynolds," Dr. Patel called out, "I think we'd all benefit from hearing more about Ms. Zhang's background. This is clearly exceptional work." Professor Reynolds froze, suddenly aware of his superior's presence. He nodded stiffly and stepped aside, gesturing for Maya to continue. Maya stood awkwardly at the front, uncomfortable with all the attention. "There's not much to tell," she began quietly. "I started coding when my father taught me basic programming." "How old were you?" someone called out. 10, Maya replied. "We didn't have much money, but we had an old computer. My father worked for a software company in Shanghai." As she spoke, her voice grew steadier. "When I was 12, I built my first real program, a system to help my mother organize inventory for her small shop. By 14, I was fixing bugs for local businesses." Dr. Patel nodded encouragingly. "And before university?" Maya hesitated, then decided there was no point hiding anymore. "In high school, I developed an app that helped students practice English pronunciation. It was downloaded over 50,000 times in China." Whispers spread across the classroom. Professor Reynolds' expression shifted from irritation to disbelief. "I also participated in 3 international coding competitions," she continued. "Our team placed second in the Asia-Pacific finals last year." "Wait," Jason interrupted, pulling out his laptop. He typed quickly, then turned the screen toward the class. "Is this you?" On the screen was an article from a tech magazine featuring the winners of the International Youth Coding Olympics. There stood Maya, holding a silver medal, her name listed as Ming Maya Zhang, programming prodigy. The classroom erupted again, this time with excited questions. Someone in the back called out, "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Maya shrugged. "In China, I stood out for my coding. Here, I wanted to fit in. I thought being quiet was better than being different." Dr. Patel stepped forward. "Ms. Zhang, our department prides itself on recognizing talent. We should have seen yours sooner." He glanced meaningfully at Professor Reynolds, whose face had turned an uncomfortable shade of red. "The algorithm you demonstrated today," Dr. Patel continued, "has remarkable similarities to work being done in our graduate research lab. Would you be interested in seeing it?" Maya's eyes widened. "The quantum-inspired optimization lab, I've read all your published papers." Dr. Patel looked impressed. "Yes, that's the one. We're always looking for fresh perspectives." Professor Reynolds finally found his voice. "Dr. Patel, with all due respect, she's a first-year student. The graduate lab requires advanced." "I believe we've just seen ample evidence of Ms. Zhang's advanced capabilities," Dr. Patel interrupted firmly. "Unless you have specific academic concerns." The challenge in his voice was clear. Professor Reynolds glanced around the room, at his colleagues, at the students recording on their phones, at Maya standing confidently by the computer displaying her brilliant code. "No specific concerns," he conceded. "Ms. Zhang has demonstrated remarkable skill today." It wasn't quite an apology, but the acknowledgement meant something. Maya caught his eye and gave a small nod of acceptance. As class ended, students surrounded Maya, asking questions about her background and the techniques she'd used. For the first time since arriving at university, she felt seen for who she really was. From the doorway, Dr. Patel watched with approval, already making mental notes about scholarship opportunities and program adjustments. Beside him, Professor Reynolds stood quietly, reassessing everything he thought he knew about the quiet girl from the back row. The truth was finally out. News of Maya's coding demonstration spread across campus like wildfire. By lunchtime, computer science students from every year were discussing what they now called the Reynolds Showdown. Versions of the story grew with each retelling. Some claimed Maya had written an entirely new programming language on the spot, while others insisted Professor Reynolds had been so impressed he'd immediately offered her a teaching position. The reality was less dramatic but more meaningful. Maya sat in the campus coffee shop, surrounded by new friends. Jason and Layla had been joined by several students from her class, all eager to talk with her. "I still can't believe you created that pronunciation app," said Emma, a second-year student. "My cousin studied abroad in Beijing and said everyone in his language program used it." Maya smiled, still adjusting to being the center of attention. "It needed a lot of improvements. The accent recognition was never as good as I wanted." "That's still amazing," Jason insisted. "Most of us were just trying to pass high school math while you were building apps with thousands of users." Maya's phone buzzed with an email notification. She opened it and her eyes widened. "What is it?" Layla asked. "Dr. Patel wants me to meet with the graduate research team tomorrow," Maya said, scanning the message. "And he's offering me a part-time position in the lab." The table erupted in cheers, drawing looks from other customers. Maya blushed but couldn't hide her smile. After months of feeling invisible, the recognition of her abilities felt like stepping into sunlight after a long winter. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from her father. "My professor showed us a video of you today," it read. "Someone from your class posted it online. I'd always told you that your talent would be recognized. Your mother and I are so proud." Tears formed in Maya's eyes. Her parents had supported her move to America despite the financial strain, believing in her abilities even when she doubted herself. As Maya walked across campus to her afternoon class, several students she'd never met smiled and nodded at her. A professor from another department actually stopped to congratulate her. The video had clearly traveled beyond the computer science building. Turning a corner, Maya nearly collided with Professor Reynolds. "Ms. Zhang," he said stiffly, "I was hoping to have a word." Maya tensed, expecting criticism or accusations about the video. Instead, Professor Reynolds looked uncomfortable, almost vulnerable. "I owe you an apology," he said, the words clearly difficult for him. "I made assumptions about your abilities based on incorrect factors." Maya waited, saying nothing. "I've been teaching for 20 years, he continued, "and I've developed certain expectations about which students will excel. You challenged those expectations." He cleared his throat. "Dr. Patel has informed me that you'll be joining the graduate lab. They're fortunate to have you." Maya nodded. "Thank you, Professor." Professor Reynolds hesitated, then added, "Your optimization approach, it was genuinely innovative. In my industry experience, I've rarely seen that level of elegant problem-solving." Coming from him, it was high praise. Maya felt a weight lifting from her shoulders, the need for his approval that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. "I still have a lot to learn," she said simply. "We all do," Professor Reynolds replied, with what might have been the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Your midterm project. I'd be interested to see what you create without the constraints of the standard assignment." As they parted ways, Maya realized that something fundamental had changed. Not just in how others saw her, but in how she saw herself. She pulled out her phone and texted her father back. "Time to start working on that new app idea we talked about. I think I'm ready." Across campus, in the computer science office, Dr. Patel was reviewing Maya's complete academic file, making plans that would change the course of her academic journey. The quiet girl from the back row would never be overlooked again. 1 month after the Reynolds Showdown, the computer science department held its annual innovation showcase. Usually dominated by graduate students and faculty, this year featured a special undergraduate section, created specifically to highlight exceptional talent like Maya's. The large lecture hall was packed with students, professors, industry representatives, and even a few local tech journalists. Maya stood beside her project display, explaining her work to a small crowd that had gathered. "The algorithm optimizes language processing for non-native speakers," she explained, demonstrating her enhanced version of the pronunciation app. "It adapts to individual speech patterns and provides customized feedback." Among those listening was Raj Mehta, founder of a successful tech startup and university alumnus. He nodded appreciatively as Maya walked through the technical aspects of her work. This has real commercial potential, he commented. Have you considered taking it to market? Before Maya could answer, Dr. Patel approached with a tall woman in a crisp business suit. Maya, I'd like you to meet Dean Wilson, he said. She's been following your work with great interest. The dean shook Maya's hand warmly. Dr. Patel speaks very highly of you. Your story has made quite an impression on our faculty. Maya smiled politely, still not entirely comfortable with her newfound recognition. Everyone has been very supportive. Not everyone, initially, Dean Wilson said pointedly. Which is why I wanted to speak with you. Your experience has highlighted some issues within our department that need addressing. She glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard. Several students have come forward since your incident, describing similar experiences with Professor Reynolds and other faculty members. The university takes this very seriously. Maya shifted uncomfortably. I wasn't trying to cause trouble. You didn't, Dr. Patel assured her. You simply exposed problems that already existed. Because of you, we're implementing new faculty training on recognizing and nurturing talent in all its forms. Across the room, Professor Reynolds stood watching them. When he caught Maya's eye, he gave a small, respectful nod. Their relationship had evolved into something resembling mutual respect. His teaching style had noticeably changed too. He remained demanding but had abandoned the public humiliation tactics. As the showcase continued, Maya's friends arrived to support her. Leela brought cookies from Maya's favorite bakery, while Jason wore a t-shirt with "Code Speaks Louder Than Words" printed across the front. Have you heard the latest? Jason asked excitedly. The department is creating a peer mentoring program, and they want you to help lead it. Maya laughed. I'm still a first-year student. A first-year student who's already working with the graduate research team and has an app with thousands of users, Leela pointed out. You're exactly who younger students need to see. Later that evening, as the showcase wound down, Maya found a quiet moment to video call her parents. Her father's face filled the screen, his eyes shining with pride as she showed him around the hall and explained her current projects. I always knew your skills would be recognized, he said, but I'm most proud of how you stood up for yourself. I almost didn't, Maya admitted. I was so close to just staying quiet. But you found your voice, her mother added, joining the call. And now you're helping others find theirs. As Maya ended the call, she looked around the showcase. New students were approaching her display, eager to learn from her. Senior faculty members who had never noticed her before now knew her name. Industry professionals were slipping her business cards. The quiet girl who had hidden in the back row had become a person others looked up to. The professor who had tried to humiliate her had instead unleashed her potential. And the university that had almost overlooked her talent was now creating new systems to ensure they never made such a mistake again. Maya Zhang picked up her tablet and opened a new project file. This was just the beginning of what she could build, both in code and in life.